The morning sun cast long shadows across the driveway as Thomas Chen stood before his new home, keys jingling in his hand. The two-story colonial house with its fresh white paint and dark blue shutters represented everything he had worked for during his 20 years in law enforcement. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming cherry blossoms from the tree in the front yard, making this spring morning feel like a new beginning. His wife Sarah emerged from their SUV, her dark hair tied back in a neat ponytail as she directed the moving company where to place their furniture. Their teenage daughter Emma was already exploring the backyard, her phone in hand as she video called her old friends, showing them around her new home. Meanwhile, 10-year-old Lucas bounced excitedly from room to room, his footsteps echoing through the empty spaces that would soon be filled with their family's memories. "Dad, can I have the bedroom with the big window?" Lucas called out, his face appearing at the second-floor window. "I can see the whole street from here." Thomas couldn't help but smile at his son's enthusiasm. It was a welcome change from the tears and protests that had followed the announcement of their move just 2 months ago. The position of police chief in Maplewood hadn't been part of Thomas's career plan. He had built a solid reputation in the busy streets of the city, working his way up from patrol officer to detective and then precinct captain. But when the opportunity in Maplewood presented itself, he thought about his family first. The smaller town offered better schools, safer streets, and the chance to make a real difference in a close-knit community. Sarah appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his. "The kitchen is perfect," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "And did you see the herb garden in the backyard?" Mrs. Miller from the real estate agency said the previous owners won awards for their tomatoes. She was already planning weekly family dinners and weekend brunches, something that their hectic city life had rarely allowed. As the movers continued their work, the Chens began exploring their new neighborhood. Oak Ridge was known for its tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes. Children rode their bikes on the sidewalks, and joggers waved friendly greetings as they passed. It was exactly the kind of community Thomas had dreamed of serving as police chief. They walked past their immediate neighbor's house, a beautifully maintained Victorian, with carefully trimmed rose bushes. Through the lace curtains, they caught a glimpse of an elderly woman watching them. Emma waved cheerfully, but the curtains quickly closed. "That must be Mrs. Whitman," Sarah said softly. "The real estate agent mentioned she's lived here for decades." Back at their new home, Thomas helped the movers with the heavier furniture, while Sarah began unpacking kitchen boxes. Lucas had claimed his room and was already planning where to put his model airplane collection, while Emma took countless pictures of her new space, planning its decoration with her friends online. As evening approached, the family sat on their front porch steps, sharing a pizza dinner among the towers of moving boxes. The streetlights flickered on one by one, and the sounds of crickets filled the air. Thomas looked at his family, Sarah pointing out constellations to Lucas, Emma finally putting down her phone to join the conversation, and felt a deep sense of contentment. Tomorrow he would start his new role as police chief, but tonight he was simply a father and husband, starting a new chapter with the people he loved most. The moving boxes could wait until morning. Right now, in this moment, everything was perfect. They were home. After their first week in the new house, Sarah Chen stood at her kitchen window, watching the golden afternoon light filter through the trees. Her fingers tapped thoughtfully against a notepad covered in lists and sketches. The idea of hosting a neighborhood BBQ had come to her during breakfast, and by lunchtime, the whole family had eagerly jumped on board with the plan. "Mom, what about these?" Emma called from the garage, emerging with a box of string lights they used for her birthday last year. The lights sparkled as she untangled them, creating tiny dots of brightness even in the daylight. "Lucas and I can hang them around the deck. It'll look magical when it gets dark." Sarah smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. "Perfect. And make sure your brother doesn't try climbing anything too high." She turned back to her planning, adding lights to the growing list of decorations. The menu was already taking shape. Thomas's famous smoked brisket would be the star, accompanied by Sarah's homemade coleslaw, grilled vegetables, and Emma's special lemonade recipe. Lucas burst into the kitchen, clutching a stack of colorful papers. "I finished the invitations," he announced proudly. He had spent the morning carefully drawing tiny police badges and BBQ grills on each card, adding a personal touch to the printed text. Sarah picked one up, admiring his attention to detail. The invitation welcomed neighbors to join the Chen family for a community BBQ next Saturday afternoon. Thomas arrived home from the police station earlier than usual, his new police chief uniform still crisp and neat. "How's the planning going?" he asked, kissing Sarah's cheek. His eyes lit up at the sight of the extensive menu. "You're letting me use the smoker. This is going to be amazing." He had been itching to set up his prized smoker since the move, but had held back, wanting to make a good first impression on the neighbors. Emma and Lucas took charge of delivering the invitations, making their way down the street together. Most neighbors responded with warmth and enthusiasm. The Patels at number 23 immediately promised to bring their famous mango chutney, while the Gonzalezes 2 doors down insisted on contributing their grandmother's secret recipe guacamole. When they reached Mrs. Whitman's Victorian house, Emma took a deep breath and walked up the neat brick path. The garden was immaculate, with roses climbing precisely trimmed trellises. She rang the doorbell, hearing it chime inside. Through the glass panels, she saw movement behind the lace curtains, but no one came to the door. After waiting politely, she carefully tucked the invitation into the brass mail slot. Back home, the preparation continued. Sarah organized their serving dishes while Thomas cleaned his smoker, explaining the finer points of temperature control to an interested Lucas. "The secret is maintaining a steady heat," he explained, showing his son how to adjust the vents. "It's like solving a puzzle. You need patience and attention to detail." That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the excitement was palpable. Emma had created a music playlist for the party, mixing classic BBQ tunes with current hits. Lucas proudly showed everyone the welcome sign he'd made for the front yard, complete with twinkling battery-operated lights around the border. "I invited some of my colleagues from the department too," Thomas mentioned, serving himself another helping of pasta. "It'll be good for the neighbors to meet some of our officers in a casual setting." Building community trust starts with simple things like this. Sarah looked around at her family's eager faces and felt a warm glow of anticipation. The BBQ would be more than just a party. It was their chance to become real members of this community. As the sun set outside their window, casting long shadows across their new yard, she could already imagine the laughter and conversation that would fill this space on Saturday. Everything was falling into place perfectly, or so they thought, not yet knowing the surprise that awaited them. Saturday morning painted the sky in soft brushstrokes of pink and orange as Thomas Chen stepped into his backyard. The grass sparkled with dew, and birds chirped their early morning songs. At exactly 7 a.m., he began his ritual of preparing the smoker, carefully arranging the wood chips he'd soaked overnight. The sweet scent of apple wood filled the air as the first wisps of smoke rose into the cloudless sky. "The weather couldn't be more perfect," Sarah said, joining him with 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to Thomas and breathed in the crisp morning air. Together, they watched the smoke curl upward, carrying the promise of the delicious meal to come. The brisket, which had been marinating for 24 hours in Thomas's secret blend of spices, waited patiently to begin its slow journey to perfection. Inside the house, Emma was already awake, carefully arranging fresh flowers in mason jars she'd decorated with blue and white ribbons. Lucas bounced between helping his sister and running outside to check on his father's progress, his energy seemingly boundless. "Dad, can I help with the meat?" he called out, watching in fascination as Thomas carefully positioned the brisket and ribs. The morning progressed smoothly as the family worked together, like a well-rehearsed dance. Sarah transformed their backyard into a welcoming gathering space, setting up folding tables with crisp white tablecloths that fluttered gently in the breeze. Emma's string lights from the previous night created graceful arcs overhead, ready to cast a warm glow when evening came. Around 10 a.m., the delicious aroma of smoking meat had spread throughout the neighborhood. Several early morning joggers slowed their pace as they passed the Chen's house, calling out friendly compliments about the wonderful smell. Thomas waved back, pride evident in his smile as he adjusted the smoker's temperature with expert precision. The peaceful morning shifted when Mrs. Whitman emerged onto her deck, her face pinched with displeasure as she looked over the fence at the growing preparations. She made a show of waving her hand in front of her face, as though fighting off an invisible attacker. "This smoke is simply unbearable," she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Lucas, who was helping Emma arrange chairs, looked up with concern. "Dad," he whispered loudly, "I think Mrs. Whitman is angry." Thomas gave his son a reassuring smile, continuing his careful monitoring of the smoker. Sarah, ever the diplomat, picked up a freshly baked muffin and started walking toward their neighbor's fence. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitman," Sarah called out cheerfully. "Would you like a blueberry muffin?" They're still warm from the oven. But Mrs. Whitman had already retreated inside, her sliding door closing with a sharp click. Through her window, they could see her reaching for her phone, punching numbers with obvious agitation. The tension didn't dampen the family spirits. Emma turned on her carefully curated playlist, letting soft music fill the backyard. Sarah returned to arranging the buffet tables, now adding finishing touches to the display of sides and salads. The coleslaw sat in a crystal bowl that had been a wedding gift, while colorful vegetable platters created an inviting rainbow of fresh produce. Thomas maintained his focus on the smoker, occasionally lifting the lid to spray the meat with apple juice, a technique he perfected over years of practice. Each time he opened the smoker, a fresh wave of mouth-watering aroma wafted through the air, mixing with the music and morning sunshine to create what should have been a perfect party atmosphere. But through it all, they could feel Mrs. Whitman's eyes watching from behind her lace curtains, her disapproving presence like a storm cloud threatening their sunny morning. None of them could have guessed just how far their neighbor would go to disrupt their celebration, or how her actions would ultimately bring the community together in an unexpected way. The hands of the kitchen clock crept toward noon as Sarah put the finishing touches on a bowl of fruit salad. Through the window, she watched the smoke continue its gentle dance skyward from Thomas's carefully tended smoker. The mouth-watering aroma of slow-cooked meat filled their yard, and already a few early guests were parking along the street, bearing covered dishes and bright smiles. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the sharp ring of a phone. Not their phone. Mrs. Whitman's voice carried clearly through the open windows as she spoke loudly into her receiver. "Yes, I've already called twice this morning," she was saying. "The smoke is completely overwhelming. My prized petunias will be ruined." She paced back and forth on her deck, gesturing dramatically with her free hand. Emma, who was arranging cups on the drink table, caught her mother's eye and shook her head. "That's the second time I've heard her on the phone," she said quietly. "She called someone earlier about air quality violations while I was setting up the chairs." Lucas, ever the optimist, suggested, "Maybe she just doesn't know how yummy Dad's brisket is going to be. Should we offer her some when it's ready?" His innocent question made Sarah smile, even as she worried about their neighbor's escalating complaints. The situation reached its breaking point just as Thomas was checking the meat's temperature. Mrs. Whitman emerged from her house, marching across her lawn with purpose. She wore a pressed floral dress and carried herself with the air of someone used to getting her way. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and a pair of designer sunglasses sat perched on her nose. "Mr. Chen," she called out, her voice sharp enough to make Lucas jump. She strode right up to their driveway, positioning herself upwind of the smoker. "This has gone on quite long enough. I demand you put out that smoker immediately." Thomas straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on his Kiss the Cook apron, a Father's Day gift from Emma. His face remained calm, his voice steady and professional. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitman. Would you like to join us for lunch? The brisket will be ready in about an hour. Join you. Mrs. Whitman's voice rose an octave. I can barely breathe in my own home because of your smoke machine. This is a violation of city ordinances. I've lived in Oak Ridge for 40 years, and I've never experienced such inconsiderate behavior. Sarah stepped forward, her natural peacekeeping instincts kicking in. Mrs. Whitman, we're so sorry if the smoke is bothering you. We're just having a neighborhood get-together to meet everyone. You're more than welcome to. But Mrs. Whitman cut her off with a wave of her hand. I've already called the non-emergency line twice, she announced, pulling out her phone again. Since they haven't responded appropriately, I'll have to escalate this situation. Her fingers began dialing with determined precision. Thomas exchanged a knowing look with Sarah. As police chief, he was well aware that no city ordinances were being violated, but he also knew the importance of maintaining community peace. He opened his mouth to explain this, but Mrs. Whitman had already turned her back, phone pressed to her ear. Yes, emergency services. I need to report an environmental hazard. She spoke into the phone, casting a triumphant glance over her shoulder at the Chen family. There's excessive smoke at 1242 Oak Ridge Drive, and I'm concerned about public safety. Several of the early arriving guests had stopped on the sidewalk, watching the scene unfold. Emma quickly ushered Lucas inside, while Sarah stood beside Thomas, their hands clasped together. The smoke continued its lazy spiral into the blue sky, carrying with it the promise of a confrontation that would change their neighborhood in ways no one could have predicted. The warm afternoon sun hung high in the sky as two pristine police cruisers turned onto Oak Ridge Drive, their lights off but their presence commanding attention from curious neighbors. Mrs. Whitman stood at the edge of her property, arms crossed triumphantly as she watched the patrol cars pull up to the Chen residence. The BBQ smoke continued its gentle dance skyward, carrying the irresistible aroma of perfectly cooked meat. Officer Mike Rodriguez stepped out of the first cruiser, adjusting his badge out of habit. From the second car emerged Officer Jenny Park, her neat ponytail swinging as she surveyed the scene. Both officers were trying their best to maintain professional expressions, but the corners of their mouths twitched with barely contained amusement. Looks like we have a complaint about. Officer Rodriguez consulted his notepad, clearing his throat. An environmental hazard. He exchanged a quick glance with Officer Park, who was now biting her lip to keep from smiling. The environmental hazard in question was producing some of the most mouth-watering BBQ smells either of them had encountered in their years on the force. Mrs. Whitman rushed forward, her designer sandals clicking against the sidewalk. Finally, I've been calling all morning about this outrageous situation. These new neighbors are filling our pristine air with smoke. It's simply unacceptable. She gestured dramatically toward the Chen's backyard, where Thomas was still tending to his smoker, seemingly unconcerned by the police presence. Officer Park pulled out her own notebook, playing along with perfect professionalism. Ma'am, could you please point out the property owner? She asked this just as Thomas turned around, his kiss the cook apron now complemented by a pair of professional BBQ tongs in one hand and a spray bottle of apple juice in the other. Lucas, who had been watching from behind the garden fence, couldn't contain himself any longer. That's my dad. He called out proudly, waving at the officers. He's making his famous brisket. Do you want to try some? Emma quickly shushed him, though she couldn't help grinning at the situation unfolding before them. Officer Rodriguez approached Thomas, maintaining his serious expression with heroic effort. Sir, we've received a complaint about. He paused, watching Thomas carefully adjust the smoker's temperature with expert precision. Actually, Chief Chen, is that your signature coffee-rubbed brisket I'm smelling? The word chief seemed to echo across the front yard. Mrs. Whitman's triumphant expression froze, then slowly morphed into one of dawning realization. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Sarah, who had been watching from the porch, stepped forward with a warm smile. Officers, would you like to join us for lunch? "The brisket should be ready in about 30 minutes, she offered, her voice carrying just enough for Mrs. Whitman to hear. Officer Park's professional demeanor finally cracked as she replied, "Well, we should probably investigate this situation thoroughly, shouldn't we, Mike?" More neighbors had begun to arrive for the BBQ, carrying side dishes and desserts. They gathered in small groups, watching the scene with interest. The Patel family arrived with their promised mango chutney, and Mr. Gonzalez carried a large bowl of his grandmother's guacamole. Each new arrival added to Mrs. Whitman's visible discomfort as she stood rooted to her spot, her phone still clutched in her perfectly manicured hands. Thomas, ever the diplomat, set down his BBQ tongs and walked over to where Mrs. Whitman stood. The afternoon sun caught his police chief's badge, which he placed on the edge of his apron, a small detail he'd added just for today's gathering. "Mrs. Whitman," he said kindly, "I believe we got off on the wrong foot. Would you join us? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can be better neighbors." The gathered crowd held their breath, waiting to see how their longtime resident would respond to this unexpected turn of events. The smoke from the BBQ, the very cause of all this drama, continued to rise peacefully into the perfect blue sky, as if reminding everyone that sometimes the best resolutions come with a side of perfectly smoked brisket. Mrs. Whitman's perfectly composed facade crumbled as she stared at the police chief's badge glinting on Thomas's apron. Her face cycled through several shades of pink before settling into a deep crimson. The phone in her hand suddenly felt very heavy, and she slipped it into her pocket with trembling fingers. "Police chief," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The gathered neighbors watched with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity as the reality of the situation dawned on her. Officer Rodriguez, still maintaining his professional demeanor, stepped forward with a gentle smile. "Yes, Mom. Chief Chen here just transferred from the city. We're all really excited to have him leading our department," he explained, casting an admiring glance at Thomas. "His BBQ skills are already legendary at the precinct, even though he's only been here a week." Emma and Lucas exchanged gleeful looks from their spot near the garden, though Sarah's warning glance kept them from giggling outright. This was a moment for grace, not triumph, and the Chen family understood that perfectly. Mrs. Whitman's shoulders slumped slightly, her earlier righteous indignation deflating like a punctured balloon. I didn't realize," she managed, smoothing her floral dress with nervous hands. "The real estate agent mentioned a new police chief moving to the neighborhood, but I never thought that he'd be your next-door neighbor." Officer Park finished kindly, "Or that he'd be such an amazing cook." She sniffed the air appreciatively as another wave of smoky, mouth-watering aroma wafted past. Thomas wiped his hands on a kitchen towel and took a step closer to Mrs. Whitman. His face held no anger or judgment, only genuine warmth. "Mrs. Whitman, sometimes the best way to get to know new neighbors is over good food and conversation. My family and I would be honored if you'd join us. Sarah made her special lemon bars, and I promise they're worth staying for." The growing crowd of party guests watched with interest as Mrs. Whitman's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Patel, who had been setting up his mango chutney on the buffet table, called out cheerfully, "Mrs. Whitman, you must try my wife's chutney with the brisket. It's a combination that will change your life." Sarah seized the moment to step forward, her natural grace turning an awkward situation into an opportunity for connection. "Please stay," she said warmly. "We'd love to hear your stories about the neighborhood. Lucas tells me you have the most beautiful rose garden on the street." At the mention of her roses, Mrs. Whitman's face brightened slightly. "Well," she said, straightening her shoulders, "those roses have won the garden club's blue ribbon for the past 15 years. She paused, then added in a quieter voice, "And I suppose the smoke smell isn't quite as overwhelming as I initially thought." Officer Rodriguez and Officer Park exchanged knowing looks. "Well, since we're here officially," Officer Park said with a twinkle in her eye, "we should probably stay to monitor the situation. For public safety, of course." She winked at Lucas, who beamed back at her, The tension in the air dissolved as neighbors began to laugh softly, the awkward moment transforming into something that would surely become a favorite neighborhood story. Thomas returned to his smoker, checking the meat's temperature with practiced ease. The afternoon sun caught the badge on his apron once more, but now it seemed less like a symbol of authority and more like a bridge between old and new, between misunderstanding and connection. Mrs. Whitman, still slightly flushed but regaining her composure, took a tentative step toward the party. Sarah appeared at her side with a glass of fresh lemonade, and slowly the woman who had called the police on her neighbors began her transformation into something entirely unexpected, a member of this growing community gathering. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Chen's backyard as the BBQ transformed from an awkward confrontation into something unexpectedly wonderful. The wooden picnic tables were now filled with laughing neighbors, paper plates loaded with Thomas's perfectly smoked brisket, and an impressive array of potluck contributions. The earlier tension had melted away like ice cream on a warm day. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Park had shed their formal demeanor, their police radios quietly monitoring channel while they enjoyed heaping plates of food. Officer Park was deep in conversation with the Gonzalez family, praising their grandmother's guacamole recipe while sharing stories about her own Korean family's traditional BBQ gatherings. You know, Mr. Thompson, a retired high school teacher, spoke up between bites of brisket. I've lived here for 25 years, and this is the first time I've seen so many neighbors in one place. He gestured with his fork at the diverse group gathered around the tables. Usually, we just waved from our driveways. Sarah moved among the guests, making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink. She paused to watch Emma and Lucas giving impromptu tours of their new house to some of the neighborhood kids. Their young voices carried across the yard, filled with pride as they showed off their rooms and the treehouse potential in the old oak tree. The conversation flowed as naturally as Emma's lemonade, with neighbors discovering connections they never knew existed. Mrs. Patel discovered that Mr. Rodriguez's daughter attended the same dance academy as her granddaughter. The Gonzalez family and the Thompsons realized they'd been vacationing at the same beach town for years without ever knowing they were neighbors. A gentle ripple of surprise moved through the gathering when Mrs. Whitman's voice rose above the general chatter. She had found herself seated next to Officer Park and was sharing stories about the neighborhood's history. You should have seen Oak Ridge in the 80s, she said, warming to her audience. The garden club was so competitive that Mrs. Henderson actually hired a security guard to protect her prize-winning dahlias. Thomas, still wearing his Kiss the Cook apron, but now relaxed and smiling, moved from group to group, answering questions about his law enforcement career and his BBQ techniques with equal enthusiasm. The secret, he told an attentive audience, is patience. Whether it's community policing or smoking the perfect brisket, you can't rush good results. The conversation naturally turned to community matters. Mr. Thompson mentioned the need for a crosswalk near the elementary school. Officer Rodriguez made notes on his phone, while Thomas nodded thoughtfully, already considering solutions. Mrs. Patel suggested starting a neighborhood watch program, and several hands shot up to volunteer. You know what we need. Lucas piped up unexpectedly, his face slightly smeared with BBQ sauce. A community garden. Mrs. Whitman could teach everyone about roses. The suggestion, coming from the youngest Chen, caused a moment of surprised silence before heads began nodding in agreement. As the afternoon wore on, the gathering evolved into an impromptu community meeting. Ideas flowed as freely as the conversation. Monthly block parties, a neighborhood newsletter, carpooling arrangements for the school kids. What had started as a simple BBQ was becoming the foundation for real community connection. Sarah caught Thomas's eye across the yard and smiled. This was more than they could have hoped for when they planned their little gathering. The smoke that had caused such drama earlier now drifted peacefully overhead, carrying with it the promise of future gatherings and growing friendships. Even Mrs. Whitman, who had begun the day by calling the police, was now deep in conversation with the young couple from the end of the street, offering detailed advice about starting their first garden. The badge on Thomas's apron glinted in the late afternoon sun, no longer a symbol of authority, but a reminder that sometimes the best way to protect and serve a community was simply to bring people together. The evening had settled into a peaceful quiet as the last party guests waved goodbye, their voices fading into the dimming light. Sarah and Thomas worked together cleaning up the backyard, while Emma and Lucas collected string lights that had brightened the gathering. The day's events felt almost dreamlike now. The drama of the morning transformed into a surprisingly successful community celebration. A gentle knock on their front door caught everyone's attention. Through the glass panel, they could see Mrs. Whitman standing on their porch, holding something carefully in her hands. The porch light illuminated her silver hair, and her expression was notably different from the stern looks they'd seen earlier that day. Thomas opened the door, still wearing his sauce-stained apron. "Mrs. Whitman, what a nice surprise," he said warmly. In her hands was a beautiful pie, steam still rising from the perfectly latticed crust. I baked this after I went home," she said, her voice softer than they'd ever heard it. "It's apple pie. My Harold always said it was the best in Oak Ridge." She paused, swallowing hard at the mention of her late husband's name. "I thought perhaps, well, after everything today." Sarah quickly stepped forward. "Please come in. We were just about to have some tea." She ushered their neighbor into their living room, where family photos were still waiting to be hung and moving boxes served as makeshift end tables. Mrs. Whitman settled onto their couch, carefully smoothing her dress. Her eyes wandered to a photograph of Thomas at his police academy graduation, then to a more recent one of the whole family at Emma's last piano recital. "You have a beautiful family," she said quietly. Lucas, unable to contain his curiosity, perched on the edge of an unopened moving box. "Did you really make that pie today? It smells amazing." His genuine enthusiasm brought a small smile to Mrs. Whitman's face. "I've been baking this recipe for 40 years, she replied, her rigid posture softening slightly. "Harold and I moved to Oak Ridge right after we got married. He was a high school science teacher." Her eyes grew distant with memories. "We used to host the neighborhood potlucks every summer, right up until he passed away 5 years ago." Emma appeared with cups of tea on a tray, arranging them carefully on a clear spot among the moving boxes. Mrs. Whitman accepted her cup with trembling hands. "After Harold was gone, I suppose I became rather particular about changes in the neighborhood. Everything different felt like losing him all over again." Thomas and Sarah exchanged understanding looks. Sarah reached over and gently patted Mrs. Whitman's hand. "Change can be really hard," she said softly. "But you know, we'd love to hear more about how the neighborhood used to be. About you and Harold." Mrs. Whitman's eyes brightened slightly. "Well, that garden you admired. Harold helped me plant those first rose bushes. He said every flower needed patience and care, just like a marriage." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue Emma quietly offered. "I'm so sorry about my behavior today. I've been watching all the new families move in, and I've been afraid, I suppose. Afraid of losing the neighborhood I've known for so long." "Sometimes the best neighborhoods are the ones that grow and change together," Thomas said gently. "Like a garden that needs both old roses and new blooms." The police chief's badge on his apron caught the light as he leaned forward to serve the pie. Lucas couldn't wait any longer. "Mrs. Whitman, would you teach me about gardening? Mom says I can have my own flower bed, and your roses are the prettiest I've ever seen." His innocent request brought genuine warmth to their neighbor's smile. As they shared pie and stories, the awkwardness of the morning's events melted away. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Whitman's beautiful roses silvered by moonlight, a reminder that sometimes the thorny moments in life can lead to the most beautiful blooms. The weeks that followed the memorable BBQ wrought changes to Oak Ridge that no one could have predicted. The incident that began with a neighbor calling the police over smoke had bloomed into something beautiful, much like Mrs. Whitman's prize-winning roses. The story of that day had become a favorite neighborhood tale, told with laughter at every community gathering. True to his word, Thomas Chen had implemented monthly community outreach events. The first block party transformed Oak Ridge Drive into a festival of connection, with tables stretching down the street and children playing games on newly chalk-decorated sidewalks. But the real surprise came when Mrs. Whitman volunteered to host a pie-making workshop in her pristine kitchen. "Everyone needs to learn the secrets of a proper lattice crust," she announced to the gathered group of eager neighbors. Her kitchen, once a solitary space filled with memories of baking with Harold, now buzzed with life. Sarah helped organize the participants, while Emma documented everything for the new neighborhood newsletter she'd started. Lucas had become a regular fixture in Mrs. Whitman's garden, showing up after school with his small watering can and endless questions. "Why are these roses pink and those ones yellow?" he would ask, carefully following her instructions about pruning and care. Mrs. Whitman's patience with his curiosity reminded her of Harold's love for teaching, and slowly her house felt less empty. The police department had changed too. Thomas's approach to community policing, inspired by his own experience as a new neighbor, had created stronger bonds between residents and officers. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Park became familiar faces at community events, their presence welcomed with smiles rather than concern. The story of their first visit to Oak Ridge, responding to a BBQ complaint only to stay for lunch, had become a favorite at the precinct. Emma's neighborhood newsletter, the Oak Ridge Observer, captured all these changes in its monthly editions. Her article about Mrs. Whitman's rose garden won first place in a local youth journalism contest. The story wasn't just about flowers. It was about how a garden planted by a loving husband decades ago had become a bridge between generations. The community garden Lucas had suggested at the BBQ became a reality in a vacant lot at the end of the street. Mrs. Whitman supervised the rose section, of course, but there were also vegetables tended by the Gonzalez family, herbs from the Patel's traditional recipes, and a special section where the neighborhood children could plant sunflowers and zinnias. Sarah noticed the changes in their home too. The moving boxes had long since been cleared away, replaced by photographs of new memories. Lucas proudly holding his first rose bloom, Emma interviewing Mrs. Whitman for her newsletter, Thomas and Officer Rodriguez grilling at the latest community gathering. Their house had become more than just a new address. It was the heart of a thriving community. One evening, as Thomas walked home from work, he paused to admire the sunset painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The aroma of Mrs. Whitman's baking drifted from her kitchen, where she was teaching a group of eager students the secret to her famous apple pie. Children's laughter echoed from the community garden, where Lucas was helping younger kids water their plants. The sound of Emma's camera clicking captured another moment for her newsletter. The smoke that had caused such drama that first Saturday had long since cleared, but its effects lingered in the best possible way. It had been the catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings. Oak Ridge wasn't just a street anymore. It was a family, growing together like the flowers in their shared garden, proving that even the thorniest situations can bloom into something wonderful. Mrs. Whitman, standing in her kitchen surrounded by new friends, often smiled at the memory of that dramatic BBQ day. Sometimes, she would say, sprinkling flour on her counter for another pie crust, "It takes a little smoke to help us see things clearly." And everyone who heard the story couldn't help but agree.